Scientists estimate that our solar system is about 4.5 billion years old. Now, we're familiar with our Sun, the star of the system, and the inner planets and outer planets that orbit the Sun. Here we see Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars. And Earth is notable in that it is the only planet in our system, or anywhere else for that matter, that we know has life on it. However, 4.5 billion years ago, the story would have been very different. Earth might have looked like this: a mass of molten rock and metal, lifeless in the beginning. Now, where did the elements come from to make up our Earth? You'll recall that when stars explode, heavy elements get created in those explosions, and they can be ejected back into space to mix with other clouds of hydrogen. And when hydrogen clouds condense, they form stars. And if there are any heavy elements that are sort of circling the star, they will aggregate into planets. But the early Earth would have been a very hostile place. It was very hot, and it was bombarded frequently by asteroids and comets. The sun would have been less bright back then, and there would have been no free oxygen in the atmosphere. Today, of course, we have millions of species that inhabit planet Earth. And so, in 4.5 billion years, we go from a lifeless rock to a rock with life. How could this have happened? One way to approach that question is to consider evolutionary theory. You'll recall that Mr. Darwin invited us to consider all species alive today as sharing common ancestry. In other words, the multi-celled organisms today can trace their ancestry back to single-celled organisms. Now, what would those single-celled organisms have been like? Well, they would have been large, complex cells, have a membrane, cytoplasm, a nucleus, mitochondria, much like amoeba, paramecia, and euglena today. So these three that we have studied are alive today, so they're on the tips of the branches out here for single-celled organisms, but the common ancestor of all of these organisms, the single-celled ones here today and the multi-celled ones up top here, would have been a single-celled organism, a large cell with a nucleus and mitochondria. However, we can ask the question, well, where did that cell come from? And again, the evolutionary answer is going to be from previous ancestors. Well, what kind of cell would that have been? A simpler type of cell. Today, we do see simpler types of cells, and we call them bacteria. There are actually two branches of bacteria. They differ biochemically, but they are both simpler than the three cells you see over here. So the evolutionary story suggests that the first living thing would have been a single-celled organism, and it would have been a very simple cell, like a bacteria. And from that original last universal common ancestor, all of life would have evolved. In addition, we considered the basic evolutionary inference that if all living things today are either single-celled or composed of many cells, then the evolutionary inference is that the common ancestor of all living things would have been a cell. So let's take a look at what kind of cell it might have been. Well, these are pictures of bacteria. And bacteria cells are living cells. They are very small, they're simple, but they perform all of those characteristics on that list that we studied to be alive. So they grow, they metabolize, they respond to the environment, they reproduce with heredity, they evolve, etc. We can think of a bacteria cell as consisting of three main components, and in fact all cells are like this. There is some boundary, the membrane. There is some kind of engine, metabolic engine. So the cell is capable of extracting energy from its food and building necessary cell parts. Proteins are the workers that do these jobs. And it's capable of reproduction with heredity. And here's where DNA comes in. So DNA is a molecule that codes for or has the information to make proteins, the workers of the cell. And this molecule of DNA can reproduce, giving rise to the ability of a single-celled organism to divide, to make two daughter cells. So let's consider then the argument that bacteria or bacteria-like cells were the first cells on Earth. Well, bacteria are the smallest and simplest cells on Earth. They have no nucleus, they have no mitochondria. And the first cells to emerge would likely be simple cells. Well, how small are they? Well, here we see a picture. There's a paramecium and an amoeba's pseudopod here. And these little tiny rod-like things, sometimes arranged into these patterns here, are bacteria cells. Here we see a very small species of amoeba, but even smaller rod-like bacteria cells. So bacteria are clearly very small cells. They don't have a nucleus, and they don't have mitochondria inside. You'll recall that complex cells have a nucleus and mitochondria. Secondly, bacteria cells show the most diversity in biochemical metabolic reactions. So it's as though they have been around for a long time, evolving new biochemical adaptations for a variety of environments. So there are many different kinds of bacteria that live in many different places, and they can survive in many different environments. And this suggests that they've been around a long time, and natural selection has generated lots of different kinds of bacteria. So the diversity of bacteria suggests a long evolutionary history. And third, bacteria can live in extreme environments. And this is consistent with their ancestors evolving in extreme environments on the early Earth. One of those extreme environments is a place like Mono Lake in California. And we're going to use Mono Lake and Yellowstone National Park as examples of what we're going to call a top-down strategy, where you study bacteria that live in extreme environments similar to the early Earth. Why do you do that? Well, they might share characteristics with the earliest bacteria. So Mono Lake is a sort of an inhospitable place from our point of view. High salinity, there's a high pH, there are toxic elements in the water, so fish and frogs can't survive in this environment. However, there are some organisms that have adapted, these brine flies, but notably bacteria. There's plenty of different kinds of bacteria that live in Mono Lake. Likewise, in Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming, here we see one of the thermals here. Now these are hot water thermals, but also like in Mono Lake, rich in microbes. The coloration you see in this thermal here is due to different populations of bacteria, diverse bacteria populations growing in these thermals. Here we see another picture. So the top-down strategy in Origin of Life studies is to study bacteria today that live in harsh environments that might have been similar in some ways to the early Earth. On our Tree of Life picture here, the idea is to study bacteria today in environments that would have been similar to life on Earth, so as to get a sense of how the first bacteria might have been making a living in those harsh environments.